You know, imagine yourself 2 years from now trying to explain a major event in your life or a major experience in your life. And we always pose the question to our colleagues, what if? We did it way back when in a competition to the Office of Emergency Management in New York. We should be posing that question to ourselves constantly because we are in an area like Japan where we are in a high-risk zone for disasters. So we're constantly posing that what-if question to ourselves, and that's one of the primary things that I observed when I was there. What if you find yourself explaining how 50,000 tons of steel landed on the Embarcadero? This is a ship in the central port of Kesunuma, right in the downtown commercial area. Landed right on the foundations. Tidal wave lifted it up, dropped it. Pretty impressive. Massive. People of Kesunuma are looking at this and they are wondering what the hell to do with it. They're considering keeping it as a monument. It is definitely something that generates a lot of interest and in the area, in the region, and in their town.
Could it not be reused for the same purpose?
It probably would be scrapped, cut apart, disassembled, carted off, or they're also talking about keeping it as a monument and a memorial. So it's huge. That propeller is twice my size. I'm standing next to it. But what if you had to explain that 2 years from now to, you know, some of your long-lost relatives in West Virginia who saw all the tweets and Facebook posts and suddenly decided to visit San Francisco and say, wow, I want to see this for myself? How would you explain that? There they are, your long-lost relatives from West Virginia, coming to check out all the what's been going on 2 years later. As an interesting side note, there's a lot, and it was a Saturday that I was there, there were a lot of tourists. So the phenomenon of dark tourism, and we experienced it in 9/11 with the World Trade Center site for a number of years as reconstruction efforts were going on. There is a lot of tourism in the area, disaster tourism. So a lot of locals in the region coming to visit, a lot of people from Tokyo coming to visit. You know, it's something that had major media impact in Japan, so it's something that people can connect to, and there are constant reminders everywhere in the region of the reconstruction process and where everybody's at with that process. So what if, you know, 2 years from now you had to explain that our emergency response and management center and over 100 members of our mayor's emergency staff perished in this event? It's pretty intense. But, you know, that emergency management center on the left is all that's left. The mayor barely escaped with his life. And you see that communications tower, which is on the slide on the right, which is the building is completely submerged underwater. That little communications tower right in front of that red little building, mechanical unit in the water, that's on the left. That's how high the waters were in that area. You know, this is totally feasible in San Francisco too. Our Department of Emergency Management, our partners over there are just a few blocks away. Van Ness and Market. It's quite feasible that we could find ourselves 2 years from now explaining the same situation to our long-lost relatives from West Virginia and walking them over to that center and showing them what happened 2 years later. This is the area of I'm going to massacre this, but Minami Sanrico, is that the way you pronounce it? It's basically an aggregate of three smaller towns, and you can see in this area the before and after shots of the water and how it crept into the brackish water and the river area, submerged the entire town right by the water's edge, and the recession of the water, what that left and its aftermath. And the images on the right are sort of slow capture images of the waters creeping up into the town's area. So, you know, those are just kind of overview photos of the event itself on March 11th, 2 years ago. So what if, 2 years from now you had to explain that our long-term response included a continuous 40-foot high pile of dirt and concrete? So the tsunami brought in water levels of 40 feet high. See that big pile of dirt right there? That's part of the cleanup effort. So 2 years later, all the waste is being cleaned up, but there are plans to build a 40-foot high pile of dirt and concrete as a big seawall barrier to protect that area from a future tsunami. You think that's a good idea? For those of us working on Sandy, we're hearing the same conversations again. Why does the town want to build a 15-foot seawall that serves no purpose? Why would you build a 40-foot seawall in front of your town along the beach when a 45-foot wave might come and all of a sudden, a couple years from now, you're stuck with a big lagoon? Questions to answer. But what if that was our response? So as I mentioned, 2 years later, and Carl has some excellent slides on the Students Rebuild website, the blog site, of some, foundations and buildings overturned, but the majority of the effort at this point has been cleaning up, debris removal, clearing everything, all the debris off the sites, all the old trees, all the old buildings, breaking down the foundations that are no longer usable, cleaning up the infrastructure, and in some cases building these large, massive seawalls. When you look at, 2 years later, victims, right, and emergency response officials, look at, don't really call, are very careful with the term victim, right? In a disaster, someone who perishes in a disaster is called a victim, and everybody else is a survivor. So San Francisco in 1906 earthquake, there were only over 3,000 victims. All the rest of us were survivors. And emergency officials are looking towards the people that they serve and really taking this to heart, that resiliency, true resiliency, is based on the fact that we're all survivors, right? And we're all going to do what we can to get our emergency kits ready, step up and help our neighbors in an event. And, that's a huge component of self-reliance and resiliency. And this is a great example in Kesnuma of faces. And these are plastered all over the place, and they're a great reminder of resiliency. I mean, these are perfect examples of folks who are survivors, right? Everyone, each of us has that capacity within us to be resilient. And that's a great example and a great installation that's out there for the public to show that even 2 years later, everyone still is in good humor and everyone still has that capacity to build back. So just general impressions, at a local level, folks are still there. Their spirits are generally still high. The cleanup process has been slow. People are a little bit frustrated in certain circles. They're still emotionally attached to the disaster. There's still a lot of monuments. There's still a lot of talk of monuments being placed permanently in the region. Spreading a little bit broader, Tokyo, and my 2 days in Tokyo, the general impression is that folks still care about the event. There's still a lot of media about the event. There is some level of detachment that certain Tokyoites feel about the event. How they can get involved. Can they still volunteer? How can they contribute? So that's just something to consider 2 years later after an event. The compassion is still there, but the 2-year life cycle is that the majority of the interest is starting to wane. Government. The government is, been heavily involved or not involved in the rebuilding process. There's a lot of pressure to move things along from the government's end, and to pay for it. And so, just recently they sold off $10 billion in national assets to start paying for some of the bills and the costs for some of this cleanup effort and this reconstruction effort. So, there's a very large amount of pressure placed on the government, and it's something that, we can learn from, and we have learned from, even here. disaster to disaster, our federal government and FEMA agencies have had different approaches from, New Orleans to Sandy and so on. They have, completely shifted their focus and evaluated their strengths and weaknesses. And they're, getting better at trying to figure out how to handle disasters. And they've made a lot of approaches in how they respond in first response and in resiliency efforts in order to make local agencies and local businesses and local people in the community more resilient and more self-reliant, because the role of a government in a major disaster can be very challenged at times and resources very limited. And then 2 years later, we also have to ask the question, what about our NPOs and our NGOs and Architecture for Humanity? And 2 years later, we're doing a little bit of self-assessment and evaluating our programs. And as I mentioned, Hiromi went into some detail the last design of the mic, and Carl will be going into some detail from his experiences, but looking at our programs, where we are, what we've accomplished, and what some of our next steps are after this interesting 2 years. So, just a quick look at some of these memorials. And I know this past week there were a lot of memorial services in Japan and in Tohoku. And just in closing, echoing some of the words of our local disaster officials, that when you're trying to do divination or trying to understand disasters or being prepared for disasters, the only guarantees that we have are that the disaster is going to happen. We don't know the specifics. We don't know water damage, seismic damage. We don't know what buildings will fall, which won't. So the only given among a series of unknowns is that it's going to happen. And it's going to be spontaneous. And the only predictability among unpredictable things is that we should ask ourselves the question, what if, and be prepared for it.